guys, it's Rose, and welcome back to A Spoonful of Geekiness. As promised from last week, today we are going to be talking about pretty much everyone's favorite supernatural being, vampires. Now, if you're just a normal person and you don't watch stuff like Supernatural, which goes into lore of a lot of stuff, the first thing you're going to think of is either something like Twilight or Count Dracula or Nosferatu, and we're going to cover all those, but we're going to cover how vampires vary in different medias. So from the books I've read and TV shows, movies I've seen, I will confess though, I have not seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer, nor have I seen all of True Blood. I'm sorry, they're not on the platforms that I have access to. So other than those two gaping holes in my knowledge of vampires, I just wanted to talk about the lore, how they're represented, and really how varied different people represent vampires. Because let's say you've seen both Dracula and Nosferatu, which are like the OG vampires, and you've also seen Twilight. You know, there are huge differences. So we're going to kind of talk about how vampires got started in stories and everything, and then also how they vary in different cultural references. So to start off, we're going to talk about when vampire stories started to emerge, and that was in the 18th century. So 1700s is when stories of vampires started to come out of the shadows, I guess. Haha, I made a pun. There are actually scientific reasons of where the myth of vampires could have come from. And there's two things that would make people back then in the 1700s think that someone was an unholy or unnatural creature. The first thing is photosensitivity, which can come in all different types of forms, most severe, causing blisters to raise on a person's skin if they are directly exposed to the sun. Now, what does that sound like? A vampire. They can't go out when it's sunny outside. Direct sunlight will either, depending on what you're talking about, it'll set them on fire, it will burn them, or if you're talking Twilight, it'll make them sparkle. This is not a Twilight rant. Not a Twilight rant. Okay. So photosensitivity is an actual thing that is the number one reason why people think vampires and their stories came into existence. Now, I'm a believer in a lot of supernatural stuff. I don't know if I believe in vampires, but I mean, I can see how if I lived back then and someone came out into the daylight and their skin just started blistering and burning, I can see how I would think, bad thing. Another thing that very possibly could have led to the myths of vampirism that started way back then is, hold on, I need to pronounce this properly. Hold on. Porphyria. If I mispronounce that, I'm so sorry. But it is a disease where the person needs other blood. So nowadays, if someone has that, they would just go get blood transfusions, like weekly, monthly, however often they needed to, in order to supplement their bodies with the blood that they themselves can't produce. However, we didn't have blood transfusions all the way back in the 18th century, so people would crave and eventually drink human blood. So once again, if I saw that without any context, all the way back then, I'd be pretty freaked out too. Imagine someone having both of those conditions in the 1700s and you're just going about your day in your little peasant outfit and you're going to the market, or you're just walking through your fields and all of a sudden your neighbor just comes out of the house one day and starts to have blistery skin, and and starts, you know, a very unusual diet. I can see how the vampire lore got started. But that's when the original tales started coming out of creatures of the dark who feed on blood and are the original feeling about vampires was that they were demonic. Many people would use holy water, crosses, stay on sacred ground to avoid these creatures that they viewed as evil. So, what can pretty much everybody agree on about vampires as far as the lore goes? Well, they're incredibly hard to kill. They're immortal. They drink blood. And they have some sort of aversion to sunlight. So those are pretty much the only facts everyone can agree on. Because if you look through history on stories and you see the media today, people can't agree on pretty much anything else. So I did some research as to some of the things that are contrasted a lot between things like, you know, Vampire Diaries, Twilight, Interview with the Vampire, the original films of Dracula and Nosferatu, and we're just gonna dive right into that because I think vampires are fun. I mean, I saw an interview with Tom Hiddleston once who said that they embody everything we want to be, which is dark and seductive with insatiable appetites. And I kind of thought that's probably where we get our fascination from. I know I'm fascinated with vampires. If you give me a TV show, a movie, as long as it's a good vampire, once again, talk about Twilight later. Not right now. I will watch it. I will give it a try. Definitely my favorite. Like, if you're gonna give me vampires versus werewolves, which is a very, very common trope nowadays, I'm gonna pick the vampires. I'm sorry. Unless I am personally born into a pack of wolves, no. Now, the first thing that is kind of controversial is their diet. And obviously we know they drink blood. As to what type of blood, that's what people can't seem to agree on. In the original stories, vampires could not drink from the dead. So if a person was recently deceased, they could not drink off of them. Or if they were drinking and the person died during their feeding, then they would have to stop, otherwise the blood would become toxic to them. One instance of this is Interview with the Vampire, starring Tom Cruise, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. I love it. I definitely recommend it. However, this makes me question in some of the other lore that they can get their blood from, like, blood bags from a hospital, like we see in Vampire Diaries. They always have blood bags from a hospital. Or if they can get, you know, just blood sourced from elsewhere. Does that make it dead blood? I don't know. These are questions I have. But the one thing, as you know, we all agree on, vampires drink blood. Now, whether or not they can be sustained on animal blood, that's another thing that is contradicted. In the Twilight series and in Vampire Diaries, as well as the original lore, vampires could, if they chose to, drink animal blood instead of human blood. Let's say they just didn't want to eat humans. Understandable. So they could drink from animals, get pints of blood from the butcher's shop, which, you know, obviously they're going to have blood all the time. So that's another contradiction. Personally, my view, on that is that vampires should be able to sustain themselves on all types of blood, both animal and human, just because I don't want a vampire who kills people. I mean, I know not all of them do, but still. So that is another thing that they can't seem to agree on. Also, there's one other alternative that is seen in Hotel Transylvania. Yes, I know it is not the most accurate as far as lore goes. And in True Blood, it's actually kind of like the center of how True Blood gets started. Is can vampires sustain themselves on synthetic blood? Personally, I think no. It doesn't contain the same properties. It's very clear from all of the myths and everything that vampires don't produce blood of their own. They need blood in order for them to still function. Otherwise, they will desiccate, which just means they will dry out, they'll turn to stone. There's a bunch of different options for what happens to a vampire when they starve. We know they don't actually die because they are immortal. That's agreed upon everywhere. Immortal but not immune. That's something important. So, I don't know. My theory is I don't think that fake blood would work, synthesized blood. If it doesn't work for transplants in humans, which as far as I know, it doesn't, then vampires can't drink it. They need blood. They need actual flowing, processed blood that can carry the oxygen, carry, just the fluids through their system, because they can't produce blood on their own. So, on their diet, those are my opinions. There's still the controversy of whether or not they can drink animal blood or if they can't. Now, in an interview with a vampire, small spoiler alert, at the end, one of the vampires does end up surviving on frogs and snakes and alligators in a swamp, and that manifests into his physical appearance. This isn't seen in other places where vampires drink animal blood. So, it's an iffy thing. Now, as far as whether they can eat human food, that's also very, very debated. In most cases, they can't, or they can, but they can't process it. Like, their digestive system is only made to process blood. So if they eat human food, they either get very ill and have to regurgitate it, or they can tolerate small amounts at a time as long as they have enough blood in their system. That's the most agreed upon method. However, there are viewpoints that, particularly in the older lore, that vampires can sustain themselves for short periods of time on human food. But that won't last them forever, and it also won't restore them if they are running low on their blood that is currently running through their body. So human food, blood, in some, like I said, in some of the original lore, they can eat it. In most of the recent lore, they can only tolerate small bits of it. Unless you're a half vampire, in which case you can eat both and survive on either. So the next thing that we obviously have to talk about are these things. Their fangs, their teeth. It has been represented in a variety of ways how vampires bite in order to get the blood. Now, the most common bite points are where major veins are available, which would be the jugular, or the femoral artery in your leg, or this part of your arm, like where they draw blood normally in hospitals, because that's where the blood flow is the strongest. But actually penetrating the skin, there have been some debates about that. Some in some lore, the vampires just have very, very sharp, human-looking teeth. You can see this in a couple different references. You can see it in Twilight. I know I'm bringing up Twilight a lot, but that's only because it contradicts so many other things that it's the perfect example for two contradicting viewpoints on vampires and what they're actually like. So in Twilight, they don't grow fangs, they just have really, really sharp human-looking teeth. And in most cases, they have fangs. Either these fangs are permanent or they grow upon, initiating feeding. Now, these fangs are meant to be very, very sharp to puncture the skin without tearing it. Because if you've ever seen a human try to, bite into a chicken leg and make a clean bite, it doesn't happen. Human teeth will rip stuff. So the fangs and or sharp teeth will help with puncturing the skin with as minimal damage as possible so that they can consume. The fangs help with puncturing the skin as little as possible so that the flow of blood from the wound is increased and they can increase the amount of blood they take during feeding time. So some examples are if you see Dracula, Nosferatu, they already have their fangs. They're permanent. They don't go away. In other examples, like the Vampire Diaries, they sort of mutate themselves when they begin feeding off of a live specimen. So it changes. It depends on what you're watching, what lore they're following, because after those original stories in the 18th century, things just got all over the place with vampires, clearly, or we wouldn't have Twilight. Not a Twilight rant. Okay. Another way that vampires have been seen to feed, and this has been seen in several different ways, actually, in Interview with the Vampire, in the American Horror Story season Hotel, where Lady Gaga plays the main vampire, they drink blood after making an incision on the person that they want to drink from. They normally carry around with them a knife, or they wear a kind of like a claw thing on one of their fingers to just slice the skin open and drink from that. Obviously, those seem to be the more civilized vampires. They don't they always make the cut first and then they drink. So that would indicate that some vampires have human teeth that would tear, and they need something else to open up that, outlet to get blood in the first place. So, as far as the bites go, whether or not an actual bite takes place or an incision is made and then the drinking of blood commences, it is agreed pretty much everywhere that the bite of a vampire is both pleasurable and extremely painful. We're discounting Twilight on this because in Twilight they have venom, which I'll get to reproduction in just a moment, but Twilight is literally the only place that I've seen where vampires have venom. Whatever. Anyways, most of the time when someone is drank from, they will experience the euphoria of the lightheadedness, the kind of rush of blood. So they'll kind of get that adrenaline boost kind of feeling, and it will be painful, but the pain mixed with the pleasure that their body is creating kind of negates each other. And also it is thought that in some lore that vampires' saliva actually contains a numbing agent so that the person doesn't feel the entirety of the bite. So that is incorporated into a lot of vampire lore, especially in the Vampire Academy series by Rochelle Mead. It is constantly mentioned that allowing a vampire to bite you is almost like intimating close relations. That's all I'm going to say. Close relations with them. That it's a very personal thing. Other things, pretty much everything else treats it as a very impersonal thing, but it does appear that most of the time humans are totally okay with this. Like, sure, bite me, suck out my blood. No, it's not okay. So the bites are mostly never extremely painful to the humans. It is normally either euphoric or a mix of euphoria and pain, which that combination often offers the person a distraction from the fact that they are literally getting drained of their blood. Now, along with the numbing agent, their saliva in some lore heals wounds. So like once they're done with a victim or passerby or whoever they're drinking from, they can heal the bite marks on the neck with their saliva as well by licking the wound. I know this sounds gross, but I don't know. I think that's kind of cool that they can seal up the wound afterwards. So that's another property that their saliva could have. Now, as far as how vampires are created, oh boy, is there a long list. As far as how the turning is done, only in Twilight have I seen a bite transform someone into a vampire, because they have their venom, which is just really weird. So normally how vampires are turned is that you would have to drink the blood of a vampire first and then either be drained of your blood and or killed. This is the only way that I've seen vampires turned in the books I've read. Yeah, there is also a string of lore that is focused on the breeding of vampires, that vampires do breed within themselves. Sometimes they breed with humans. The best example of this that I can give is the Vampire Academy books by Rochelle Mead, because there is a hierarchy of first the purebred vampires that their families go back ages, and then you have the Dhampir, which are half vampire, half human, and in the original lore, they were able to breed. They were able to have children and procreate that way. However, the majority of that lore has kind of faded away and has been replaced with vampires turning other humans. Typically, vampires don't turn other humans. They normally find other vampires, create a coven, as Twilight called it, even though that's the word for witches. But they'll create their own family. They might turn someone occasionally if they find them particularly beautiful or talented and they want to keep them alive forever, or they turn people who are their mates. Now, in all of supernatural lore, there is this constant theme of mates between humanoid creatures. In the high fae and werewolves and vampires, even in the lesser fairies and pixies and all of those creatures, they have a mate. A mate is their equal in every way. It means that as soon as they see this person, whether they're human or vampire or whatever, no matter which side of the immortality spectrum you are on, when you find your mate, you bond, and then typically, if that person is not already vampire, werewolf, fae, whatever, they become one. Now, Twilight is the only good example of this. I mean, in this case, Twilight is actually a pretty good example for this. We see that Edward finds Bella, his mate. He does avoid turning her until, you guys know the story of Twilight. I don't have to explain it, but he tries to avoid turning her, but eventually does, so that they can live out their mated lives forever. And also the other couples in Twilight are mates. They are mated. This is the only saving grace for Twilight, as far as vampire lore. They actually do a pretty good representation of what it's like for mates to find each other. The absolute kind of passion and dependence on each other that they have, the absolute love, the fascination. So Twilight's only saving grace, really. And that's why Twilight is my guilty pleasure, because it has, like, people have a misconception about Twilight. They think it's just vampire versus werewolves, which, by the way, those are not werewolves. They're shapeshifters. And, this girl who has to have a boyfriend. And no, that's not it. It's how far would you go for your family? And it's essentially the mating and love story of Bella and Edward. Okay, done talking about Twilight now. It is so hard not to go into a rant about Twilight, one way or the other, for or against it, when talking about vampires. Okay, anyways. So that is an instance where a vampire will turn someone. They've been in the different lore, in the histories, no matter which kind of vampire you're looking at, they normally turn exceptionally talented people into vampires to preserve their creativity and everything, or they turn their mates if they meet their mate and their mate is still human. Very obviously, so that they can be together forever. So, at this point, we've covered what they eat, how they came into being, how the stories themselves came into being, how they transform someone else into a vampire or turn. Now, for their weaknesses. There's a lot of debate. One thing that has been kind of pushed to the side and has kind of faded away, unless you're in hardcore original vampire lore, is the idea that vampires are demonic or evil. In the very original stories, crucifixes, holy water, sacred ground, all of those things would deter a vampire, but moving into recent culture, that is not the case. So holding a cross up to the vampire hasn't really been a thing, except I do remember it being used in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the couple episodes that I have seen. So that is very base lore. Normally, their weaknesses now are obviously the sun. They can't be exposed to it because they will most often burn to the point of death if they don't get back inside fast enough. We're not going to talk about the sparkling. Not the sparkling. Okay. And aside from that, there's the old garlic trick. Garlic is now thought to be repulsive to vampires, not because of any of its innate qualities, but because they have extremely heightened senses, and even us humans can get overwhelmed by garlic. Imagine if we had super sense and we could just like smell every molecule of garlic. I think we'd be overwhelmed too. I think we would classify that as a weakness. So garlic, along with like the holy stuff, is set aside. Silver was another thing that was said to weaken them, but that was also with the demonic idea that vampires were evil because silver is considered the purest metal. The weaknesses that have stayed are things like decapitation, stake through the heart, fire, sunlight has stayed. In Supernatural, they decapitate vampires. In Vampire Diaries, they stake vampires. But like Count Dracula says in Hotel Transylvania, like a stake to the heart, who wouldn't that kill? So, yeah. Now, in Vampire Diaries, I have not read the books, by the way. I have only seen the TV show. They do seem incredibly sensitive to wood. Why? I don't know. Like, you'd think that a regular stake made of literally anything would work, because the heart is obviously what pumps the blood. It's what's keeping them alive. And decapitation also follows that, because the brain, you need both your brain and your heart to survive, especially if you live on blood. Both are blood pumping organs that rely on blood to continue working. So, like, I get stabbing or decapitating, but why wood? That I don't get. Like, why wood? Anyways, going beyond that, those are the basic ways to kill a vampire. And it is recognized throughout all of vampire lore that vampires are incredibly hard to kill. They have superior strength, senses, and agility to humans, all of which are powered up if they've just recently fed on blood. And yeah, that's about it, you guys. In closing, I think vampires are really cool. Do I think they're demonic? No, not in the slightest. I think that they are another creature born from lore and from fairy tales and from genuine, actual diseases that people just happen to witness in the wrong time. I do enjoy stories about vampires immensely, as long as you don't take the evil route, and they're just simply a creature, then I'm totally cool with that. I mean, I like so many supernatural creatures. High fae are my favorite. Vampires are probably second. So maybe next week we'll cover high fae. And that's fairy, spelled F-A-E-R-Y instead of F-A-I-R-Y. Those are without doubt my favorite supernatural beings of all time. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little lesson on vampires from the tiny tidbit of knowledge that I happen to possess. If you guys know anything else, please comment it down below. If I'm wrong about something, comment it down below, because I am always intrigued to learn lore and new information about mythical creatures, beings, all of that stuff. So hopefully I've given you your vampiric spoonful of geekiness for the day. And as a madman in a box once said, run fast, laugh hard, be kind. Bye, guys.